Hey everyone, how are you doing? Lee here. I heard not the whole thing, but I had heard a good deal of the interview that Ace did with Eddie Trunk today. Ace had apparently wanted to come back on Eddie's show and spill some dirt about Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons. Well, that didn't happen. I mean, there were a few things that he said, and one interesting thing that I thought was kind of a little bit important. But for the most part, let's say there's an album that a group makes, and they plan on making it a double album. But for some reason, the record company decided that they needed to release it 2 discs instead of 1. The first week is part 1 of the music, and then the next week they're going to put out the second disc. And when you hear that first disc, you think it's a pretty cool album and you like the songs, so you can't wait to hear the second disc, which is supposed to be the even better songs. And when you hear them, they're not that great. They might not be terrible, but they're not the great songs you thought they were. There might have been a few minutes in each song that's like a good guitar solo or something, but for the most part, the best stuff was in the first disc. And I would have to say that aside from how Ace sounded in this interview, which was more coherent and seemed like he was more together than he was in the last interview, and it wasn't a horribly bad interview either, so let me get that out of the way. There were moments that were entertaining, but the first one that he did, I thought that even though he sounded stranger and was kind of going off on the rails, at least that had a more interesting character to it. But except for a few moments that were important. The first main moment that's going to be the one that a lot of people will touch upon if they talk about this is that Paul Stanley apparently called Ace and said that Ace could go F himself. It was pretty much F you, Ace. I'm not going to apologize. That was pretty much what he said. And hung up. And to me, I thought that, well, at least Paul responded to Ace. He didn't completely ignore what Ace said. But then it made me think that, well, it kind of made me think that maybe it was Paul's way of saying, go ahead, say whatever it is that you're going to say, because I'm not going to be intimidated by you. And so if that's the case, then at least Paul was kind of cool in that sense, if that's how he meant it. The fact that he was kind of willing to, in his sort of way, allow Ace to say whatever Ace wanted to say about him, if that was the point. But I think mostly the point was that Paul might have thought that if Ace and Peter had played in the band, then they really should be called Piss, and that maybe Paul was saying that he wasn't going to apologize because he meant it. I don't know for sure. But then Ace said that Doc McGee said that Paul didn't call him. So Paul either did call him or didn't, but Ace said that he recognized Paul's number and the Verizon indicator of the calls he got. And so if Paul is saying that he didn't call Ace, then maybe that's for legal reasons. He didn't want to have what he might have thought was evidence in case Ace wanted to do something like say stuff about Paul or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, I thought that at least if Paul was going to call Ace and say that, then at least own up to it. Either that or Doc McGee could be not wanting to admit that Paul called Ace. Maybe Doc is concerned for himself and thinking that he doesn't want to say anything that's going to make anybody else look bad. So he's going to say, no, Paul didn't call you. So that just in case Paul asks Doc, did you tell him that I called? Then Doc would be able to say, no, I told him that you didn't call. But if Ace had picked up the phone and Paul talked to him and he knew it was Paul and it said on the message that it was Paul, then that would be like if you had a bottle of juice and I walked right up to you and I took it from you and started to walk away, and when you said, hey, give me back my juice, I'd say, I didn't take it while I still have it, you know? Kind of like that. But okay, aside from that, there was a lot of talk about how Ace did the logo for Kiss, and then Eddie was asking about, surely, of course, you could have played in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for a couple of songs, and that kind of conversation was kind of a little bit long. Like they kind of went over that a lot, and it might have been like filler, like you eat your popcorn and watch the scene in the movie where the guy is about to knock on the door, but he's still standing there, and you're watching for about half hour and he still hasn't gone up to the doorway and knocked on it, but you know it's going to happen. You know he will knock on the door, but it's been a half hour. That's sort of how this interview was. It was like it was a lot of filler where not a lot happened and you were hoping that eventually something would happen. And that's what a lot of it was. There was a moment where he talked about his ex-girlfriend, Rachel Gordon, and how Paul and Jean had apparently paid her money in a non-disclosure agreement so that she wouldn't talk about a court case where she was suing them. And there is a newspaper article about that. It doesn't necessarily mention whether the case went through or whether or not she got the money, But whatever the case may be, she apparently had filed a suit, and apparently Paul and Jean were paying her money to have her keep quiet about it. And so the fact that Ace had talked about that, especially when she was suing Ace too, I think that's it. I don't think Paul was the one she sued in the thing. I think it was Jean and Ace. Yeah. So my apologies for that. But I mean, in the past she said a lot of stuff about Paul. So it's not like she sued him, but it's also like she wasn't really doing him any favors in interviews that she did where she talked about him. You know, she pretty much was saying a bunch of really, really intensely shocking stuff about him. But at least she didn't sue him. But she did sue Jean. She maybe had less shocking things to say about Jean in general, aside from what she was saying as far as the court case, which was pretty bad. But she was also saying in interviews bad stuff about Ace too. So anyway, the fact that Ace had alluded to it and didn't really get a lot into it, and the fact that Eddie didn't ask him more about it for whatever reason, maybe Eddie didn't want to go there, but that was interesting, and it made me credit Rachel a little more, because it seems that Rachel might be telling the truth about some stuff. And I think that Ace, I still think that the reason why Ace left her was probably because after a few years he leaves one lady and goes to another one, and it kind of doesn't matter whether the lady's crazy or normal or whatnot, if she provides for him what he wants, whatever that is. And so yeah, other than that, I would have to say that the interview, should you watch it, I'll probably try again to watch a little more of it. I heard about maybe 3/4 of it, or whatever the case may be, but the parts that I did heard, they kind of kept repeating themselves. So if you want to hear an interview where Ace talks about how he designed the makeup and how Paul is now trying to claim that he designed the makeup, and if you want to hear for a very long time about how Ace and Peter could have played a few songs on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, then this interview is for you. But for those of us who were waiting to hear some dirt, well, Ace said that he changed his mind because he said he didn't want to stoop to that level, and that people had advised him not to go that route, and Eddie Trunk, I think, was one of those people who suggested that. That brings me back to the idea of the record, where the first album that you buy from part one of the 2-part set is the best stuff, but they tease you by saying the second album is going to be better, and then when you get that second album, it's not better. In fact, it's not quite as interesting. That's so how this was. It was almost like we were teased to think that this would be the great interview that we needed to see, and it ended up being an okay interview if you've never seen an interview with Ace before. But if you've seen many interviews with him, it just seemed kind of tired. And aside from a few interesting points, which I did think were worth hearing, it was basically just middle of the road and not what we were expecting. And as a side note, I think that that's going to be the case when people go to the last Kiss show. They're going to think that there's going to be a lot of great stuff going on, and that's going to be a great show, so people are buying tickets. And then when they go, they find out it's just going to be another show just like all the others were. And we were teased to think otherwise. So all of this stuff that we're getting on Kiss is pretty much, I think, unless Ace changes his mind again and decides to dish out some dirt, or whether or not Paul makes a statement about whether or not he said the F word to Ace in a phone call. Unless that stuff comes to pass, I would say you're going to hear different people do podcasts and talk about it like I am. I'm talking about it because I feel like, why not give my opinion? It's worth it to share with people what I thought. But other than that, if the only thing people are going to do is just mention the details without giving an opinion, then, well, that's like what the press does anyway. They keep saying things over and over and over and over again, and we never get anything new, even though we think we will. And that's sort of how this interview was. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say it was a 5. Because it had some interesting moments and it wasn't bad, but it wasn't the thing that it was being said it would be. So, yeah. Should you hear it? I would say if you're kind of sleepy and you want to go to sleep and you're not really able to, but you still think that you can watch something before you go to bed, it'll put you to sleep. It'll make you think, okay, this is good sleep material. Anyway, I do hope that one of these days Ace will put some dirt on Paul and Gene, because I do like to hear about that. And I also think it will then give more of a verification of what Rachel Gordon was saying about what Ace was telling her. So, do I believe there's a manuscript? I don't know, but I do believe that in his mind there is. I do believe that maybe he mentioned a whole bunch of stuff to his writer friend who wrote it down. I don't think he wrote it, but I think that if it exists, it's pages that were cut from his regular No Regrets book. But until that happens, I would say I would just be a little bit leery of if there's going to be any supposedly shocking evidence of anything, because right now Kiss and Ace and everybody are being teases. They're not really giving the goods. They're just pretending, or they're giving our hopes up by giving a little bit, but not quite as much. Anyway, those were my thoughts. And take care, everyone. Bye.